What does it mean to live with strength in a world that constantly tests you? Some people say strength is found in action, fighting for what's right. Others believe it lies in restraint, choosing peace when anger feels justified. But maybe strength isn't just one thing. Maybe it's about knowing when to act and when to step back. This balance, the mastery of yourself and your values, is at the heart of the Junzi, Confucius' version of the noble person. But being a Junzi isn't easy. It's a rebellion against survival, pride, and performance. It's a way of living that asks you to bloom without needing the world to notice. Strength isn't always loud. If you've watched Vinland Saga, you know that Thor's understood this. He said a true warrior needs no sword. But that didn't mean he rejected strength. He had mastered it. The sword to him wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of himself. And when you wield something that can harm, you need to ask yourself, when is it truly necessary? Passivity in the face of injustice only leads to the tolerance of it. Ignoring oppression is complicity. But strength isn't about charging forward without thinking. It's about knowing when action is needed and when it will only cause more harm. It isn't just someone who's virtuous. It's someone who has mastered themselves so completely that their values become their way of life. In Confucian thought, the Junzi lives by principles like Ren, which is compassion and empathy, Li, respect for traditions and maintaining social harmony, and Yi, righteousness and the courage to do what is morally right even when it's hard. But the Junzi isn't meant to be perfect or untouchable. They're supposed to be a work in progress. In the Analects, Confucius says, the noble person is ashamed if their words exceed their actions. It's a reminder that being a Junzi isn't about lofty ideals, it's about making those ideals real, even in small moments. In Chinese literature, the Junzi often appears as a figure caught between the mundane world and a higher moral path. If you look at stories like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it portrays figures like, forgive me for botching this, Zhuge Liang, a brilliant strategist who lived by the integrity even when it cost him everything. The Junzi stands as a reminder that living virtuously often means standing apart, not out of arrogance, but out of a commitment to your values. It's easy to be good when you're surrounded by goodness. But what about when the world is indifferent or cruel? To stay virtuous when nobody else is, that's the greatest test. Some people hold on to faith, a belief in heaven, karma, or some kind of justice beyond this life. But others root their virtue in something more internal, self-respect. Because when you compromise your values, you lose something deeper than public approval. You lose yourself. But here's the truth. Staying virtuous is exhausting. Revolutionary Frantz Fanon wrote about the toll that colonial oppression took on the soul. He warned that staying silent under systemic violence wasn't peace. It was destruction of the self. To resist is to preserve not only your life, but your dignity. And that's the struggle of the Junzi. To be kind, not because it's easy, but because it's a rebellion against despair. Compassion isn't always selfless, and that's okay. Sometimes compassion comes from knowing what it feels like to hurt or be hurt. It's a choice we make to avoid causing harm because we've lived through pain ourselves. But there's also another kind of compassion, the kind that seems innate, where someone just helps because they can, without needing to have experienced suffering. Maybe you've asked, is one more valuable than the other? I don't think so. Compassion at its core is a discipline. It's about showing kindness, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Like from the book Babel by R.F. Kuang, Robin Swift starts off with an instinctive care for others, but the world hardens him, and in contrast, if we look back at Vinland Saga, Thorfinn learns compassion the hard way, through war and through loss. Both forms of compassion are meaningful, but they do carry different scars. Compassion isn't passive, it carries responsibility. The more we understand others, the harder it becomes to justify harm, even when we're justified in feeling anger. But understanding doesn't erase injustice. That's where the Junzi stands apart, not by avoiding the conflict, but by bearing the weight of deciding how and when or whether to act. This is the true burden of the Junzi, knowing that sometimes compassion alone won't protect others. Sometimes even integrity feels too small in the face of systems built on cruelty. But before you raise the sword, you have to ask, what am I protecting? And at what cost? Figures like Thor from Vinland Saga chose to put down the sword, even if it meant his death, because his battle wasn't for legacy, it was for the lives in front of him. But not every fight allows you to walk away. Malcolm X understood that there are moments where survival demands confrontation. The Algerian revolutionaries of the FLN believed that their freedom couldn't be won with words alone. And this is where resistance becomes complex, when the cost of violence collides with the cost of doing nothing. So let's talk about resistance. Can it ever be truly non-violent? Malcolm X once said, "You can't have peace if you don't have justice." He believed that oppressed people had the right to self-defense. In contrast, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. emphasized non-violence as a form of moral high ground. But here's the catch: both men knew that resistance requires courage. Algerian revolutionaries fighting for independence from French colonization faced the same dilemma. The FLN, or the National Liberation Front, believed that violence wasn't just justified, it was necessary. They saw French control not as something to negotiate with, but as something to break entirely. If we talk about R.F. Kuang's Babel again, Robin began his rebellion with the hope for peaceful change, but his story ended in tragedy. His dream of a new world was buried under the weight of the system that he tried to dismantle. Thor, on the other hand, refused to fight because he knew violence had no true end. It only ever led to more cycles of death. So what are we really fighting for? Are we trying to leave behind a legacy? Or are we striving to live with integrity in the present? This is where the Junzi comes back into play. The Junzi isn't concerned with applause or recognition. They sow the seeds knowing they may never see the flowers bloom. Thor never saw the man Thorfinn became, and Robin never witnessed what became of his rebellion. But their stories remind us, failure isn't defined by what you don't witness, it's defined by what you stood for in the moment. Being a Junzi isn't about perfection. No human can be perfect, everyone is with their flaws. But it's about commitment. It's about wielding strength without pride, acting without seeking praise, and upholding your values even when the world tempts you to abandon them. Humanity in general can't be summed up by one definition. It's a question. Who am I when no one is watching? The answer doesn't lie in legacy, it lies in presence. It's not about what we leave behind, it's about how we live now. You might never witness the full impact of your actions, but as long as you choose virtue over vengeance, compassion over control, and wisdom over reaction, you've already succeeding in upholding the values of a Junzi. And in a world that rewards anger and performance, that strength is the most radical act of all. There's no shortcut to strength or wisdom. It isn't found in loud declarations, flashy personas, or oversimplified ideas about dominance and control, hyper-masculine figures. You know who I'm talking about. Whether they're selling outrage or pseudo-intellectualism, they aren't offering transcendence, they're selling a performance. But strength isn't in the performance, it's in the presence, the real path, the harder path. It isn't about tearing others down to prove your worth, it's about transcending your fears, evolving past your insecurities, and standing firm in your values, even when no one else is. That is how you master yourself. So, in a world full of noise, choose to be quiet. That is the path of the Junzi, and it is yours to walk.